Christopher fucking Nolan. What a polarizing filmmaker this gentleman has become for me. On one hand, he has created one of the greatest comic book films of all time in The Dark Knight. And then a few years later, he went around and, in my opinion, created one of the worst fucking comic book movies of all time with The Dark Knight Rises. Good God, do I hate that movie. But that's a video for another day. His filmography speaks for itself. He likes to do mind-bendy things. You know, he definitely likes to challenge the viewer in certain ways, as evidenced by Memento and Inception and Interstellar. He makes event films, and to be honest, that's very admirable. You know, he's almost like Steven Spielberg is in that sense. You know, you get the feeling like you're going to miss out on something if you don't go to the theater to see the latest Christopher Nolan flick. Something he has to definitely be commended for is making an attempt to bring people back into theaters, at least in a big way. And he does that with IMAX. You know, he's dabbled with IMAX with The Dark Knight Rises, Interstellar, and now Dunkirk. In fact, the bulk of Dunkirk was shot in 65 millimeter and 75 millimeter IMAX. It's all over the fucking place. But before we get into the movie, we have to talk about the formats you can see this movie in. Now, it's I wish it were as simple as saying, okay, go to your nearest IMAX theater and you're going to see the best possible version that Christopher Nolan meant you to see. And that is not the case at all. It's far more confusing than most Christopher Nolan movies, sadly. And this is one of the few times where I actually had to do my homework. I had to do homework before seeing a movie to figure out like the best possible way I could see it, you know, in my area. And so let me break it down for you. Here's the different formats you can see Dunkirk in. You've got what's arguably the best format, the format Christopher Nolan wants you to see it in, which is IMAX 70 millimeter. Good luck finding a theater in your area. From there, we got 70 millimeter and going down to the typical 35 millimeter, which is, you know, your everyday movie. Well, at least before, you know, digital. I know what you're thinking. You're like, Sean, how do I know if, you know, it's playing in IMAX 70 millimeter near me? Well, fortunately, most theaters have a list up, which you can go online and check for yourself. But if you do have an IMAX theater in your area, and I use the term IMAX loosely, back in the day, IMAX used to mean one of those theater screens that were fucking huge, you know, and you could see things, you know, on that screen that were shot with the real IMAX cameras. Nowadays, most theaters have what's known as, you know, lovingly referred to as FOMAX, which is, you know, I guess what the new definition is for IMAX nowadays, which is it's a bigger theater, it has better sound, but it's not that huge fucking screen that, you know, that most of these real IMAX movies, you know, have been shot on. I mean, it's a bigger screen, but it's not like the real IMAX screen. And that most likely is what you're going to end up seeing this movie on. You know, which is still pretty big. It's, you know, if that's the best you can do, then that's it. And in those theaters, you will probably see one of the following. You're going to see it in IMAX with laser or IMAX Xenon. Now, that's 3 different variations on IMAX right there that could have varying, you know, aspect ratios. And that's not even including the varying aspect ratios that Christopher Nolan shot this fucking movie in. You know, here's the thing. Christopher Nolan, I commend you for taking the next step and you know, not just pushing 3D, but, you know, pushing 2D in a different and exciting way. But fuck, you have to get with these theater exhibitors and distributionists and get them on par, all right? Because the problem is not all these theaters have the same projectors. They don't want to order projectors for, you know, this 1 or 2 movies that maybe hit in a year that actually utilize, you know, IMAX cameras. And that's the problem. Unfortunately, we're left with this, you know, doing your homework and, you know, hopefully you have a theater in your area that's gonna play it in the format that the director wishes. And if not, you know, just try to do the best possible thing. Now, in the end, is that going to change the contents of the movie? You know, not really. Granted, movies shot in IMAX look amazing. They're big. Now, sometimes it can be a problem, and I'm going to get into that. And I did find this problem with Dunkirk as well. Not too much, but a little bit. And that is the entire movie is not shot in IMAX. generally IMAX cameras are very loud. So for dialogue heavy scenes, directors choose to go with the smaller cameras. And why not? Because they're not the big money shot scenes. So, most of the time audiences won't care. I care. All right. And, maybe it's just me, but anytime I see a movie with IMAX scenes and the aspect ratios fluctuate, large, small, it takes me out of the movie for a second. And there's a noticeable drop in quality. Personally, I would rather have consistency. Now, fortunately for Dunkirk, it was shot in mostly IMAX. The bulk of the scenes you're going to see were shot in those giant IMAX cameras, and you're going to see that on the screen. It's not so bad. But there was a handful of scenes that were shot with the smaller cameras, and even if the IMAX cameras are very loud, we have the technology. We can dub it over. It's called ADR, additional dialogue recording. Why don't you just do that? Christopher Nolan, just shoot the whole fucking thing in IMAX, and then we won't have to worry about it. But, again, that's just me. Some people won't be bothered by those varying aspect ratios. I personally am. But, I'm also a whore for seeing IMAX. So what can you do? So now I think we can talk about the movie. Now I got all that technical mumbo jumbo out of the way. The focus on this film's story is pretty narrow. When the film opens, we're already at the beaches of Dunkirk, and we're seeing the British and French armies just kind of stranded there, waiting for relief to come, waiting for backup. Mostly backup that's not going to come, and those soldiers were stuck on the beaches, and basically the enemy was just completely surrounding them, bombing them, shooting at them, just basically wiping them out. Of course, now we did get hundreds of thousands of troops off those beaches, thanks in no small part due to a lot of the civilian ships who were willing to come over to Dunkirk and pick up some of the soldiers, in the meantime. So obviously this is a classic war story that has a lot of potential to be very emotional, and it's, an epic, and it is, for the most part. There are some issues with the story. One is the varying timeline. There's actually 3 stories being told at once. One on the ground, at the beaches. One in the air with the pilot, played by Tom Hardy. And then we have one at sea with some of the civilians going out to Dunkirk to rescue the soldiers. As Nolan has stated, the story we're following on the beaches took place over the period of a week, while the ship itself, the boats on the water, was only, a day, and the planes maybe an hour. So to tell the story he wanted to tell over the course of the film, he basically combined all the stories to play out together. So we kind of jump around in time, and there is mixed success with this. Obviously, we do want to be introduced to all the characters of the story, right off the bat. And how do you go about telling all of their stories, from beginning to end if the time jumps around so much? With that said, it all comes together in the end, where all the timelines kind of sync up, and we see how the characters and their actions, affect each other. And that was done really well. We'll get back to that in a minute. Personally, I feel that Nolan could have told his story within like the last day of Dunkirk. I mean, he absolutely took a few liberties historically as far as writing the story versus the history, but that goes for any movie. I don't believe that a movie should have to be 100% historically accurate. It needs to be a movie first and foremost. Granted, there is some things that you just shouldn't change at all. But I mean, look at the movie Braveheart. We love that movie, and it's not historically accurate, in the least. But it's a movie. It's not a history book. So I do feel that Christopher Nolan could have tightened up that narrative so it wasn't quite as confusing, because we open up and we're like, what's happening? Sometimes you cut to a scene that's happening at night and then back to day and back to night. And it's a little confusing. It's a little jumbled. Sometimes the scenes go together pretty well, and sometimes they don't. But I think with another draft of the script, he really could have nailed something a little stronger. The film's first act is definitely its weakest, and I think is the detriment to the film, depending on what you're looking for in this type of film. As the movie opens, we're thrown right into Dunkirk. We're thrown right into the battle, and it's, similar to Saving Private Ryan, and in that the movie opens, with a somewhat of a battle scene, or at least throwing you right into the midst of war. And the tricky thing that Nolan tries to pull off here is that he doesn't really give us much of an introduction to the main characters. It's filmmaking 101 that you give a character some sort of introduction for the audience to latch onto, to give the audience a reason whether or not to like a character. That's the point. Why else would we watch all these movies and stick around for 2 hours to see what happens to them? Granted, Dunkirk does have the historical aspect going on for it, but the lead character on the ground, we're never given an introduction to. So it's through his actions that we have to decide whether or not we like him. That goes for everyone in the film. That goes for the civilians on the boat who are traveling to Dunkirk. That goes for the 2 British pilots, Tom Hardy included, who are flying around, and of course all the men on the ground. Now, if you've seen the movie and I were to ask you who your favorite character was, I'd be willing to bet that most people would say Tom Hardy. And that is the right answer. I mean, that's a silly thing. It's an opinion, of course. But I would agree with you on that opinion. And ask yourself why. He doesn't have a lot of lines of dialogue in this film. Now, Tom Hardy is a charismatic actor, so he has that going for him. But no, it's the actions of his character. He is a heroic pilot, and when it comes down to it, selfless. So of course he's going to be the favored character of the movie. Now, here's one of the issues, is that the character we arguably follow around the most, his name is Tommy, who's on the ground. The first thing we see him do is just run from battle. Now, he's trying to escape. He meets up with some more of his fellow soldiers, and instead of staying to fight, he runs. All right, and he runs, and that's our introduction to the character, that he's somewhat of a coward. All right, that's fine. Granted, it would have been a nice moment to see if he could turn around and help his fellow soldiers, or see something that he could try to help out. At least that would give us some insight into his character without him having to say it. But there's something that happens soon after that kind of seems just as cowardly. Of course, all the soldiers are on the beaches, and he's waiting around, and after a bombing, there is someone who's wounded on the ground, and he noticed a bunch of medics carrying wounded soldiers onto a ship. So he looks at the body, and he's befriended another soldier on the beach, and they decide to take the wounded soldier and sneak on board. And it should seem crafty. I mean, I can't blame the guy for wanting to survive. It's war. It's fucked up, all right? You just want to live. You want to go home. But, through the first act of the movie, he seems very cowardly. And it's not something, he never seems to stop to try to do the right thing. He seems to try to do the selfish thing. And granted, that definitely does ease up over the course of the movie. It's not a total 180. We don't see him become a total hero or anything like that. We just see him, try to survive. But it's survival in a way that feels selfish, There is other soldiers he does stand up for as the film goes on. But it was a hard character for me to latch onto at first and to really buy into and to care about. And when you don't care about your lead character in a war movie, that kind of fucking sucks. The second story takes place with some civilians as they travel. They're traveling to Dunkirk, and of course they rescue a soldier on the way, played by Cillian Murphy, who's been in several Christopher Nolan flicks by now. And Mark Rylance plays the father character, the captain of the civilian vessel. He's a great actor, but this story kind of seemed a little lukewarm until they actually get to Dunkirk. And then we have, of course, the final story, which takes place in the air. The air. And that was definitely the most engaging as far as all the stories go. It's almost impossible nowadays to talk about a war movie and not talk about Saving Private Ryan, because what Steven Spielberg accomplished there was not only a great sense of realism as far as war goes, but also characters that feel colorful and that you care about. And I don't mean colorful in the literal sense. You look at Saving Private Ryan, it's a fairly bleached film, purposefully so. But characters that you remember traits from, whether it be like the cowardly Upham, or Tom Hanks, the mystery surrounding Tom Hanks of what did he used to do before the war, because he's so good at war, and that revelation, and so on and so forth with all the soldiers, as far as Saving Private Ryan goes. And when we watch Dunkirk, it's like, we don't really care that much about anyone. There are some horrific things going on there. Not too horrific. It's PG-13, so don't expect like super realistic war. But fortunately, they managed to avoid mostly scenes that might depict some really gruesome actions. We see some bombings from afar and gunshots and stuff, but nothing like guts coming out, anything like that. So at the end of the day, I'm afraid to say that the characters do feel a little bit cold. You don't really remember or care too much about them as the film is going on. You're just kind of watching how everything that unfolds in the action scenes. And that leads us to probably the best part about Dunkirk, is the way some of the scenes are staged in film. There are some beautifully shot scenes in Dunkirk. The cinematography is really top-notch at times, and really puts you right in the middle of the beach, of the war zone that's going on. Given how I feel about the characters, I feel the story only really ramps up towards the final third, when all the stories converge and everything kind of comes together, and we get the resolution of the story. I can't go without mentioning the score of the movie, which was done by Hans Zimmer, which is Nolan's usual, composer. Hans Zimmer is very hit or miss for me these days. As far as Nolan scores are concerned, Nolan isn't very interested in kind of the classical film score. He likes to push it a little bit to be a little more, I guess, abstract, you could say. Just compare, for example, the Batman scores by Danny Elfman that was done in the Tim Burton movies versus the Batman scores, that was done in Christopher Nolan's movies. It's night and day. The score for Dunkirk I found to be very grating. I think a lot of people will find it to be an effective score. Arguably, a lot of it is noise. I read online that Hans Zimmer actually recorded Christopher Nolan's pocket watch and kind of used it throughout the score, which is really fucking annoying. I think it's a really cheap tactic to show tension, and kind of a time counting down, to actually use the sound of like a ticking clock or any kind of ticking in that sense, where it's like, it's just, they use that in the trailer and stuff like that. And I think maybe that might be okay for shorter scenes, or maybe if you build something interesting around it. But here it takes up a lot of the score. A lot of the score is just fucking noise. I just feel it's a cheap way to try to ramp up the tension, rather than writing a traditional and moving score and letting that kind of be a little bit of subtext for the tension in the scene, But, that's just my preference. I know I'm not the biggest Hans Zimmer fan in the world. The man is a great composer. He has done some phenomenal scores in the past, but this is one of the most least interesting Christopher Nolan Hans Zimmer collaborations that I've heard in quite a while. Okay, so what does it all mean? It means that we're left with a war movie that's very well shot and has some great imagery and some tense sequences, but it ultimately feels pretty sterile, considering the lack of interesting characters that we're given to latch onto. The characters that we care about, they don't really exist in this movie, save for, the pilot Tom Hardy plays. And even then, there is a scene at the end of the movie, his fate seems questionable, given what happens to him, why something else couldn't happen. But, I won't spoil it. But it's a Christopher Nolan flick. I think if you love Christopher Nolan and his output, you'll probably dig this movie. For me, he's a mixed bag. There's movies of his that I absolutely love, like Memento and The Dark Knight, and there's movies of his that I don't care for, like The Dark Knight Rises or Interstellar. Dunkirk, for me, kind of falls in the middle. I liked it okay. I don't have a great desire to return to it, anytime soon. But For what it's worth, he knows how to craft a movie that's custom built to be seen in theaters. And I think that says something. You know, I think it is important to have those event films that you want to go to a theater to see. You are glad you sat your ass down in that theater seat, you know? And this is definitely one of those movies for what it's worth. Even if at the end of the day, I just thought it was, you know, it was good. You know, it didn't blow me away. It didn't have me thinking about it for days on end afterwards. But again, it's that movie you already know if you're going to see. So it's a lot better than Dark Knight Rises. That's the only review you need from me.